Hard for me to give a speech like this and not talk about history. So bear with me as I give you a very quick history lesson so that you understand the context of the speech and the moment 50 years ago. To appreciate the significance and importance of the 1963 March, you have to have a good awareness of the history of the civil rights movement for African Americans. It's also important to understand that there are other such movements in America for several groups: Asian Americans, Latino Americans, Native Americans, the LGBT community, and women. The victories that all these groups have gained have helped to make us a better society in America. For African Americans, the fight for civil rights did not begin on August 28, 1963, but decades before, even before the Civil War and Reconstruction. Wherever there were free blacks, they were fighting the best they could for greater political, economic, and civil rights, including in this great city. Immediately after the Civil War ended in April of 1863, African Americans found themselves free men and women that had some options. And one of the first things they did is they went and found their families and brought their families back together, reunited their families that had been broken up due to slavery. The next thing they did is they found work, quite often working at their, okay, we got a problem here. It's not moving ahead. Can I use the keyboard? Thank you. All right, it can only get better. All right, so the second thing they did was they found employment, quite often working as sharecroppers. Ooh, my wife is here. Stand up, honey. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Okay? People always joke that I don't have a wife. Okay, and she's not rented. That is my wife. All right. So the second thing they did was find work. Quite often working as sharecroppers, their choice for their former masters on the same land that they worked as slaves. The next thing they did is find education or create education opportunities for their children. They already knew the value of education, even back then. The next thing they did is they established churches. Before they could go to churches, but it was usually their master's church, and usually it wasn't a black pastor. So they established churches, and then they found their own pastors. African Americans wanted the same opportunities granted white Americans. They wanted the guarantees and protections stated in the U.S. Constitution. They wanted the opportunity to provide for their families. Like so many Americans, they dreamed of better futures for themselves, but mainly for their children and grandchildren. It was then and still is today the American dream. They hoped that with the individual rights protected in the Constitution, their hard work, dedication, and strong faith was all that they needed to succeed. Initially, most of these rights were granted in the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendment. But just as quickly, those rights were taken away, especially with the end of Reconstruction in 1877. The former Confederates regained control of the southern state governments, and white supremacy was reestablished in each southern state. The greatest example of white supremacy were Jim Crow laws, which at the end of the day were rules and practices put in place by whites to control most aspects of the lives of blacks, especially in the public sphere, including how blacks were expected to interact with whites. Violation of the laws or practices such as something as simple as drinking from the white water fountain or trying to vote could result in the loss of one's home, job, freedom, meaning prison, or even their lives, the loss of their lives. So some of the images of Jim Crow, I love the one on the far left, no dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans. Those are really tough times. Jim Crow laws also existed in parts of the North, but mainly by practice rather than by law. Beginning in the 1890s, Southern legislatures began to ratify new constitutions, creating barriers to voter registration and more complex election rules. African Americans were barred from voting through devices such as poll taxes, property and residency requirements, and literacy tests. The use of violence quite often was the key by white supremacists to reestablish and maintain white rule in the South. The overwhelming majority of acts of violence against blacks were never prosecuted. If a case made it to trial, the aggressor was acquitted, especially since blacks could not serve as witnesses against whites. Unfortunately, I have to show you some disturbing images. Unfortunately, the lynching of black men and some women was the norm in the South, usually by mobs. This here is a female. Her crime was she tried to stop the mob from lynching her son. So what did the mob do? They lynched them both, hanging them both from a bridge. And then the last image is actually not a human body, but an effigy stating that warning blacks that if you were trying to vote, that would end up happening to you. Violence through race riots was another way blacks were controlled. There's a long history of riots in America resulting in thousands of blacks being killed, but few whites. Blacks often lost some or everything that they owned. There was a riot here in Springfield, Illinois in 1908, which actually led to the creation of the NAACP. There was a riot in 1919 on the south side of Chicago where several blacks were killed and a lot of property destroyed. So that was another way of controlling African Americans, both in the North and in the South. Yet, in this highly discriminatory environment, blacks found ways to protest, and they tested the laws of the land, though usually unsuccessfully. In the famous case Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, a U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was legal. Unfortunately, in reality, the ruling legalized separate but unequal in society as it applied to housing, public facilities, schools, public transportation, and economic opportunities. It took over 50 years, whoops, I need to go back. It took over 50 years with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, where the U.S. Supreme Court reversed Plessy versus Ferguson decision, this time ruling that separate but unequal was unconstitutional. More specifically, the court ruled that establishing separate public schools for black and white students was unconstitutional and that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This ruling paved the way for integration and was a major victory of the civil rights movement. In spite of the Supreme Court's ruling, change would not come easy. The use of violence, as it was used 100 years before, was a card white supremacists felt they could always play, leading us to Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old who was murdered in the South, actually in Mississippi, 58 years today. So this is the anniversary of his death. His death was not just the results of individual acts of violence. By the way, he was only 14. It was not the results of the individual acts of violence, but a statement that blacks needed to remember their place in society, specifically in Southern society. The crime represented the 1950s version of lynching. He was tortured and then murdered for breaking Jim Crow practices by supposedly whistling at a white woman. Till became a martyr in the civil rights movement as it became invigorated out of outrage by all Americans. So he was down there visiting in Mississippi. He was actually from Chicago. His mother sent him down there to visit with his family. So he's actually, he was actually buried here. His funeral was here, and he was buried here in Chicago. By the end of 1955 began the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott was a political and social protest campaign against the policy of racial segregation on public transit system of Montgomery, Alabama. It began in December 1955 when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to surrender her seat to a white person, which was a policy and practice of the day. It ended victoriously for the movement on December 20th, 1956, when the city ended its segregation policy on the buses. The boycott brought to the national stage, there's some other images, people walking rather than taking the bus. Brought to the national stage Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He was only 27 years old when the boycott began. He became the voice of the movement. That said, he was not a mouthpiece for the movement. Instead, he was best articulated to the rest of America and the world what the movement was all about. He best articulated the pain and suffering and oppression of Black America for the last 100 years. He articulated how the movement was a movement for all Americans for the betterment of American society. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. 1963 marked the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. Then a few days later, January 6th, this handsome guy was born. Yes, that's me. And I know what you're saying. I'm just as cute as I was 50 years ago. I'll get back to him in a moment. January 14th, the newly elected governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace, took the oath of office. In his inaugural speech, Wallace used a line for which he is best known. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Then March 23rd, 1963, Loyola University Chicago defeated University of Cincinnati to win the NCAA championship in Louisville, Kentucky, in basketball. In the Loyola Mississippi State game, this is a picture of that game. In the regional semifinal, Mississippi State, an all-white team, played despite protests from the governor and the state police of Mississippi. Mississippi State overcame a state prohibition against playing integrated teams. How'd they do that? They snuck out of the state to play the game. Loyola beat Mississippi State and went on to the Mid-East Region Championship. In the national championship game, Loyola started 4 African Americans and Cincinnati started 3, making it the first time that a majority of African Americans participated in the championship game. And the last picture is when they visited the White House for the 50th anniversary of that victory. In April 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, LCLC, which was founded in January of 1957 with King as its first president, began a campaign against racial segregation and economic injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. The campaign used nonviolent but intentionally confrontational tactics. Black people occupied public spaces and marches and sit-ins, openly violating the laws that they considered unjust. During the protests, the Birmingham Police Department, led by Eugene Bull Connor, used high-pressure water jets and police dogs against protesters, including children. Footage of the police response was broadcast on national television news and dominated the nation's attention, shocking many white Americans and consolidating Black Americans behind the movement. The campaign was a success. Connor lost his job, and the Jim Crow signs came down, and public places became more open to blacks in Birmingham. During the campaign, King was arrested and jailed 13 times of the 29 times that he was arrested in his lifetime. In 1963, before the march. King, representing SCLC, was among the leaders of several civil rights organizations that were instrumental in the organization of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was the official name. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which took place, again, 50 years today. The march made specific demands and an end to racial segregation in public schools, meaningful civil rights legislation, including a law prohibiting racial discrimination in employment, protection of civil rights, protection of civil rights workers from police brutality, and a $2 minimum wage for all workers. Just some more images of the march. So the speech, standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, MLK delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech advocating racial harmony during the march. There were 9 speakers before him. There were several musical performances. The speech was actually just 17 minutes. The I Have a Dream portion is known to have had several versions written at several different times as early as 1960. King was always adding and changing the speech. At the end of the speech, King departed from his prepared text for a partly improvised version of the theme, I Have a Dream. The speech invokes the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the United States Constitution. He even referred to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The ideas in the speech reflect King's social experiences of the mistreatment of blacks. The speech draws upon appeals to America's myths as a nation founded to provide freedom and justice to all people, founded on the precept that all men are created equal. He then reinforced this by putting equality in a spiritual context, arguing that racial injustice is against God's will. Thus, the rhetoric of the speech provides redemption to America for its racial sins. It was a time to do the right thing, to atone for the wrongs done before, specifically for the last 100 years. In this way, the speech is a speech of hope and faith that America can and will do the right thing by all its people. The march was a resounding success. More than 250,000 people of diverse ethnicities from all parts of the country attended the event. At a time, it was the largest gathering of protesters in Washington, D.C.'s history. For King, some of the gains were almost immediate. King was named Man of the Year by Time magazine for 1963, just a few months later. And in 1964, he was the youngest person ever awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 35. Politically, the march put pressure on the Kennedy administration to advance its civil rights legislation in Congress. The administration was already working on a civil rights bill, and the success of the march, including King's speech, helped to galvanize grassroots as well as political action in Congress. Thus, the march is widely credited with helping to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act outlawed major forms of discrimination against racial, ethnic, national, and religious minorities and women. The Voting Rights Act prohibits discrimination in voting, prohibiting states and local governments from imposing any limitations on account of race or color. For African Americans, the passage of the two acts presented African Americans with vast opportunities that they did not have before, economically, socially, educationally, and politically. For America did a better job living up to its precepts that all men and women are created equal and endowed by God with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For other marginalized groups, especially women, the Civil Rights Act provided greater opportunities in American society. Unfortunately, the dream has remained out of reach for many Americans today. There's a tremendous amount of poverty around us, including in Maywood. There's a lot of crime and violence around us due to that poverty. Many people still don't have access to quality education or quality jobs. There are health disparities, which we talk about all the time on this campus. There's a lot of hard work still to be done by us individually and as a nation. Like Dr. King, we must have hope and faith. For me, back to this guy, I would not be standing here before. Can everybody see that picture on this side? Okay. I would not be standing here before you today if not for the educational opportunities granted me as an African American and as an immigrant. Most of you know I was born in Belize. I came here when I was 4. The economic opportunities have enabled me to be hired as the second African American assistant dean on this campus and the first associate dean at Stritch. My wife and I live in a very diverse community where our children have gone to school and made friends with other children of different races and ethnic groups. For Stritch, if you look around, half the classes have been women. We have a much more diverse student body. We have the first female dean in Stritch's history. We have our first diversity dean, and I can keep on going. However, as a university and a health science campus, we refuse to sit on our laurels. There's always more to be done. One of our focuses now is to give students who only know and love one country, the US. They have lived here for most of their lives, having been brought to this country as children. I'm referring to the DACA students. DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. With the American dream in mind, it's not ironic that many of us simply refer to these students as dreamers. A reference to the DREAM Act, which Congress never passed, which would have granted these students a passage to US citizenship. We are the only school in the country that are accepting applications from Dreamers, and next year in the class of 2018, we plan on having our first Dreamers enrolled at Stritch, right? Dean Jones. I have no doubt, none at all, that if Dr. King was alive today, he would support us fully in this endeavor. On that note, I end my speech. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and happy 50th anniversary to all of us. Thank you.